The Man Who Played with Time, written by A.W. Burnell, narrated by Edward E. French. Part 2. I'll go on with my tale, if you so desire. See, Austin was saying, the year 1917 is 13 past, isn't it? Now, to reach that year, it is necessary to turn this small dial until it points to 10, leaving the larger dial untouched. Then, after inserting the lever into the third slot, we are ready to close the switch by throwing it to the left, so, and commence our journey. When Austin clicked the switch over, a sound of well-oiled machinery whirred softly in my ears. The platform on which we stood began vibrating gently beneath us. Faster and faster it vibrated, while a queer feeling stole over me. I felt almost as though I were in a swiftly descending elevator. Then I seemed to see Austin and myself regarding a duplicate of the machine on which we now stood. Suddenly, the scene became obscured by several huge bubbles of azure hue, revolving easily in a circular motion. Without a sound, they burst before my fascinated eyes, sending lazy tinted streamers floating, swaying to the floor, darkening my view of the laboratory. However, before the colored clouds obliterated the room and its contents, my counterpart backed toward a small table, turned, disarranged the things thereon, clutched it firmly in both hands, then sank to the floor with the table still held tightly in his grasp. Austin's chuckle reached my ears. I looked at him, smiling myself at the antics my double had gone through. The shimmering azure blurred my friend's visage somewhat, but I could see that he was wearing a broad grin. He spoke. "Boy, you sure looked funny then. I wouldn't have missed that for 1,000. He had scarcely finished when he became totally invisible to me because of the hovering blanket of blue. In a short time, a tiny fleck of white appeared in the center of the pall. Soon, by degrees, the whole grew larger. It seemed as though we were speeding down a tube of living color, a tube which began where we had started and ended in the constantly enlarging hole of white. As this opening increased in size, bits of scenery could be observed, growing steadily clearer. When I noticed this, I began wondering what the people of the past would think of us, and where we would come to rest. I begged my friend to stop for only a minute or two, for I knew it would be embarrassing to me to be exposed to the public gaze while I stood on this infernal contraption. The second problem was easily solved. Before Brahms had built his laboratory in 1928, there had never been anything on the site as far back as I could remember. It had never been more than a vacant lot since my childhood, anyway. I had scarcely ceased my musings when we emerged from the tube of color and stood gazing at the village of Flintsville as it was in the year 1917, a few weeks after the United States had declared war against Germany. On the side of the street opposite us was a long line of young men pressing forward toward a door over which was a crudely painted red, white, and blue sign that read, "Enlist here." Before our eyes were living, breathing men who, perhaps, were later on to give their lives for their country, stood before our gaze, recalled from the dead to live again, a brief scene of the past for us. It was uncanny. On all the corners were little groups talking, arguing, and gesticulating. Beneath an American flag stood an army officer, haranguing a crowd gathered about him on patriotism. A truck loaded with the recently enlisted rumbled down the street, followed by a host of shouting youngsters and barking dogs. "What do you say to a good old-fashioned 5-cent schooner of beer?" I asked Brahms, pointing across the street. My friend's gaze followed my finger, which indicated an old building whose stained glass window bore the words, "Jake's Place. Good beer and lunch." "I'm afraid not. You see, I shouldn't like to leave the machine, for if anything should happen to it, we'd never be able to get back to the future." "Future? Of course, this surely isn't the past anymore, now that we're here, is it? And what was the present to us a minute or two ago is now the future. It just goes to show how non-existent is time. One instant the present is called the future, in another it is called the present, another second elapses, and it is called the past. How idiotic!" "Say, don't you think we had better be getting along? Let's go back farther, shall we? I put in. I'm certainly curious to see something real old. My fear was entirely gone now, and I was thrilled with the prospect of another voyage. Let me see. All right. What do you say to a visit to America as it was in 1492? A few months before the landing of Columbus. Let's see. 425 years ago. 420 for the small dial, and the 5th notch to the lever. All set? Let's go. He pressed the switch, and the machinery whirred. During all the time we had been in the lot, we escaped notice, probably because the tall grasses hid the time eliminator from view, and it looked as though we were standing on the ground. But just as the first bubble of blue burst and sent its streamers of living color drifting before our eyes, a newsboy of about 15 years espied us. His mouth was open. Evidently he was trying to sell Brahmas and me a paper with the latest war news in it. In a moment, he had backed away and was lost to view in the pall of blue. I guess he was mighty surprised to see his prospective buyers fade away into thin air before his startled eyes, for all the world like a couple of stage magicians. As we hurtled through the whirring tube of azure hue with ever-increasing speed, I remarked, "Say, Austin, didn't that newsboy seem familiar to you?" "Indeed he did. Do you know who he was?" I shook my head. "That boy's name is Austin Brahmas. Austin J. Brahmas, to be exact. He was a bit over 16 in that last scene." I was dumbfounded. "What?" I demanded. "Now, don't try to kid me. You know as well as I do that's utterly impossible. How could that boy have been you? Granted, we can make the past live again, as we've been doing. How is it that we can change the past? When you were 16, the very first time, I mean, you know right well that you never saw two men standing in a lot dissolve into nothingness, did you?" "Well, my boy," replied Austin, his eyes twinkling with merriment, "for one thing, that wasn't the past. It was the present, even as it is now the future. But that is not the point. I maintain that time, or rather, the scenes which compose time, remain intact forever. Don't ask me how or why, because I haven't the slightest conception. Nevertheless, it remains so. And if a person is in some way returned to the past, I know that he may, to a certain extent, mind, I say to a certain extent, change that past without in any way affecting the events to come. Or, I had better say, the events ahead. They are already here. We, in our eternal snail-pacing, never-ceasing creep into the 4th dimension, have merely not overtaken them. Yet." By this time, I was becoming too bewildered to think. Accordingly, I changed the subject. What on earth, I wanted to know, did a mass of blue bubbles and a peculiar pulling sensation have to do with traveling, whether it be in the 4th or any other dimension? My young friend hastily assured me that the tube of color and all the attending sensations were the product of our own minds. "For instance," Brahmas explained, "that young relative of mine, the newsboy, saw no color phenomenon. We simply faded from his sight, I imagine. Like yourself, I see no possible connection between our motion in the 4th dimension and color. Therefore, old son, our senses are tricking us. Probably our terrific speed causes some disturbance or distortion of the light waves reaching our eyes, affecting the optic nerves in such a manner that the bursting balloon effect is produced. On the other hand, the feeling you describe as pulling is due, no doubt, to our actual rapid motion in the 4th dimension." And thus we conversed as we raced back over the centuries on the most remarkable and diabolical invention ever to spring from the mind of man. It took only 4 or 5 minutes to land us at Flintsville, April 19, 1492. There was a slight jar, and the machine stopped. We stood on a small, flat-topped, stony rise in the center of a broad expanse of boulder-covered ground that evidently had at one time been a river of considerable size. Now, though, the arroyo was devoid of any moisture. "Say, my boy," I mocked Austin's peculiar habit, "lucky for us this contraption didn't stop on a hillside and roll to a spot where, when we materialized in your room again, we'd be on the exterior of the bed or something." "I hadn't thought of that." He responded seriously. "It would be a dangerous thing to have our position altered, for, now that you mention it, I doubt whether we could step off this platform to move the machine and remain alive. If I had accepted your invitation to leave the machine and cross the street to that saloon a little while ago, we would undoubtedly both be dead now." Why? I demanded. I don't recall exactly what he answered now, but it was to the effect that we were part of the past only while we were under the influence of the time eliminator. There would be no telling what would happen should one of us step from the platform, he told me. Perhaps the careless person would even be thrown into a fifth dimension. His concluding sentence was, "But if someone from the past should step on the platform, I can foresee no possible danger to him, since he would still be in his own plane or world. For, you understand, it is we who are influenced by the fourth dimension, not the scene before us." All thoughts of this perplexing situation faded from my mind for the moment, because, glancing toward the edge of the forest to the rear and to the right, I beheld a human figure step forth from the shadow of the trees into the rosy, if somewhat pale, light of the setting sun. I nudged Austin and pointed. The figure was that of an Indian, outfitted with bow and arrow, and he was followed by a score or more of others, some with burdens, some empty-handed. A hunting party returning to their village with the spoils of the day, was my guess. Manifestly, we were not seen, for the group struck out straight across the riverbed some distance below us, without so much as a glance in our direction. We watched the little company in motionless silence as it trooped along over the rough ground at a steady, tireless pace. Then suddenly, as the sun sank still lower and shadows lengthened, a ray of sunlight found an answering flash in the polished mechanism beneath us. The silhouette of the leading Indian stiffened and tensed, stopping instantly. Turning his back to the sun, he scanned the landscape in our direction intently. He easily discerned the form of our machine with us on it, situated as we were on the tiny plateau in the midst of the arroyo. Waving his hand aloft, he shouted some unintelligible sound and made off in our direction at a fast trot, the string of followers tagging along at his heels. "Austin!" I exclaimed in a sharp bark. "What do they intend to do? Kill us?" "No, of course not. Why should they want to murder us? We are total strangers to them. They've never seen a white man before in their lives. But to please you, I'll play safe and set the dials for our return. Then all that I'll need to do, in case danger threatens, is to throw over the switch, and we'll be off for the future." I kept my eyes on the rapidly nearing band, while Austin fumbled with the controls. I almost hopped off the platform when my friend ejaculated, "Ouch!" So absorbed was I in staring at the approaching savages, who, by all sane reasoning, had been dead for over 4 centuries. Brahmas turned a scowling face toward me. "Say, that mosquito certainly had a nerve to bite a distinguished visitor like me." "Why? How is that?" I questioned. I thought you said we were under the protection of this contraption of yours. Didn't I understand you to say a few moments ago that it would be death for a creature of the past to step aboard this platform?" "No, I said we are under the influence of my invention only while we stand on this platform. The instant we step off, heaven only knows what would happen. But since the landscape before us, and consequently everything in or above it, is untouched by our fourth-dimensional stimulator, that confounded mosquito could and did land on my neck without any harm to himself. You see, he still remained in his own sphere. Understand?" I nodded in a dazed, bewildered manner. "The thing is a little difficult to explain, but maybe... I've got it. Comparing my invention to an airplane, the identical results are obtained. Listen, supposing you take a ride in a plane. While you're in the air, you daren't jump without a parachute, for you are suspended among the clouds only through the power of your machine. On the other hand, a bird may alight on your ship without danger of sinking, disregarding, of course, all hazards from wind, propeller, etc., by reason of his already being suspended in the sky without mechanical aid. You cannot leave your plane and expect your body to be supported by the air. The bird, however, can rely on your ship to support him. Of course, the bird really required energy to remain aloft, while the mosquito needed no effort to remain at this fourth-dimensional height, if I may call it that. However, we mustn't neglect our friends here." He swung toward the Indians, who had arrived by this time and were engaged in examining us at a distance of about 10 feet. Their faces showed that they were filled with curiosity, not unmixed with considerable awe. As an opening gesture of ambassadorship, Austin waved a friendly arm in their direction. At this, the leader, who was much older than the rest, and manifestly of a higher standing than any present, conferred with a haughty individual standing at his side. The latter was conspicuous by reason of a good deal of ornaments or charms he wore, and by reason of the evil, arrogant leer on his scarred, unlovely visage. The two talked in a monotone, using a vast amount of pointing and gesticulating to help out. Once the older man gestured toward us, then touched his cheek, meanwhile shaking his head. He had noticed our white skins, even in the half-light of dusk. The malevolent one, who appeared to be some sort of a medicine man, seemed to grow angry, his countenance darkening and becoming more malicious every instant. Then, when the leader designated us with one hand and swung the other in an arc as if to include the heavens above us, the medicine man, if that's what he was, gave the impression he was about to burst. He stamped his moccasined foot, snapped his head back and forth with almost inconceivable rapidity, then poured a perfect deluge of sounds into the older man's ears. His listener remained passive throughout the blustering speech. The one-sided conversation ceased abruptly, and the elderly one stepped close to where we stood, disregarding the angry protests from the wrathful one. After a somewhat humble bow, he directed a few concise statements to us in a manner that was nothing if not respectful. Even in the darkness, I could see what a splendid physique he possessed. Tall, straight, firm, and strong he was, with a noble posture that would have been the envy of many a king. His followers were not a whit less splendidly built, although they were scarcely more than lads. The speaker finished with a polite beckoning for us to get down off the platform and fall in behind him. "Sorry, old man." Austin shook his head and smiled. "We don't speak your lingo." At this reply in an unfamiliar tongue, the Indian started back a step, eyes wide, surprise in every feature. He was clearly taken aback. During the performance, the evil one had been peering intently in our direction, drinking in every detail of the scene. Now he sprang quickly forward, his adorning trinkets rattling noisily, and commenced another torrent of guttural remarks addressed to the leader, all the while glaring at us with malignant distrust. Taking in the pernicious, leering face of the medicine man, the hesitating, puzzled look of the elderly one, and the ready for peace or war attitude of the followers who stood not far off, expectantly watching, I became fidgety, nervous. I whispered an anxious plea to Brahmas, but he paid no heed. His whole person was absorbed in deep fascination at the debating pair. Finally, with an impatient thrust, the glaring one pushed the leader aside, strode up to Brahmas and me, giving an order in a decidedly overbearing tone, at the same time bestowing upon us a withering glance and motioning us imperiously to descend from the machine. "I don't like him," declared Austin to me, giving a vigorous shake of the head to inform the Indian of our intention of staying where we were. Again the medicine man snapped out his command. He was answered by another defiant toss of the head from Austin. With an angry, inarticulate snarl, the Indian reached out, seizing my inventor friend's arm tightly, roughly attempting to pull him to the ground. "Stop that!" uttered Austin fiercely, his pale blue eyes flashing with the glint of hard steel and his face growing white, as it always did when he became angry. My friend always disliked anyone who tried to enforce a disagreeable order by bodily strength, and now I could see his temper getting out of all control. With a jerk, Austin yanked his arm free and ordered the menacing savage away. My friend was breathing heavily, and his face was aflame as he whipped his hand in a half-circle to disperse the band of red men. Then, turning on his heel, Austin stepped over to the controlling switch, stretching forth a hand to flip it over. But the persistent medicine man was not thus to be thwarted. With a lunge, he scrambled onto the platform with us, reaching out to clutch Brahmas and drag him backward off the machine. Even before I could cry out a warning, Brahmas had turned instinctively to face his tormentor. What then occurred will forever be imprinted on my mind. I hadn't taken part in this vivid drama of the clash of modern and primitive man so far, and now each was oblivious of all save his opponent. In dumbfounded amazement, I stared, petrified, even as were the rest of the spectators opposite me. Like an invisible and unseen observer, I watched breathlessly. The two stood facing each other. Austin with clenched fists and squared jaw, the savage with twitching open hands and heaving chest. Austin fainted. Then, as the Indian's hands thrust at the laboratory apron he wore, my friend, eyes blazing with fire, struck out with all the power in his far from feeble right arm, putting all his weight behind the blow. The fist caught the insolent savage squarely in the center of his sinister face with a loud smack. The Indian was lifted clear off his feet and hurled backward off the platform, landing heavily on his back in the dirt. He lay there silent and motionless, blood spurting from nose and mouth in a crimson flood. Not a groan, not a twitching muscle betrayed any sign of consciousness in the recumbent form. Brahma stood nursing a red, stinging fist, while I awoke to action and sidled over to the control panel, reached out, turned the switch with a loud click. Before the mechanism began its smooth whirring, a sharp twang penetrated to my ears. Then the vibrating platform beneath me sent a thrill of joy surging through every fiber of my body. In silence we sped through the time dimension, Brahmas not speaking, and I glad of the quiet that enabled me to compose my excited feelings. My heart was filled with rejoicing at the queer sensation denoting our tremendous velocity down the time tube. In an amazingly short time, I thought the machine slowed down. The platform ceased vibrating. I breathed a profound sigh of relief and glanced around for the familiar white plaster walls of Austin's tiny room. The next instant, I swallowed at a lump that suddenly swelled in my throat, and the back of my neck felt clammy and prickly. The machine had stopped, and we were not in Austin's room. The scene before me was almost identical with the one we had just left. There was the same wild, untamed vegetation at the edge of the arid, stony, dry riverbed in which we were, and the same wild, dark forest silhouetted the pale light of the moon off to my right. The one salient feature, the one that made me thankful from the bottom of my heart, that marked the variance of the view before me and that era left behind, was that nowhere was a sign of life, animal or Indian, apparent. But in a flash, the horror of the thing became vividly clear, striking home with a force that left me breathless. Marooned in the heart of a savage, primitive land where no white men would appear for perhaps hundreds of years. I could feel my whole body sag. I felt weakly limp. A choking gasp from the region of my ankles caused me to look down. There lay Austin at my feet, eyes closed, face white and drawn, his bosom splashed with red, and an arrow protruding from the region of his heart. I was absolutely crushed at this development. Austin, my friend, the only person in the entire universe who could get us out of this awful predicament, at my feet, dead or dying. Fate had cast me away in a lost land, and not satisfied with this, was taking my only hope of rescue beyond my reach. Then the fact became clear to me that it was my friend who was at my feet, my school chum, dying. I was thoroughly humiliated at the idea that I had been thinking about my own safety when Austin lay so still on the platform, needing aid, and needing it quickly. Of course, these thoughts were only vague, half-defined, as they flitted through my mind in one fleeting instant. I mustered every ounce of energy I had in my sagging form so that I might be of aid to Austin with rapid but composed action. I dropped to my knees and, hoping against hope, made feverish attempts to revive my injured friend. My efforts were at last rewarded with an almost inaudible utterance. "Are we home?" I strove to make my voice sound soothing as I answered, but when my gaze roamed involuntarily to the dismal scene about me, my voice wavered weakly as I forced the words from my dry, hot throat. Yes, just lie still until you feel better. Everything is all right." At my feebly spoken words, Austin glanced out of the corner of his eye at the surroundings. At first he tensed, then his eyes widened. He made a queer noise I judged to be a pitiful attempt at a chuckle. He was not successful. The try ended with his clutching his breast with both hands, gritting his teeth noisily as he did so. In a moment he seemed to gain strength. Shortly afterward he sat up, wheezingly, and spoke. "There. I feel better now. That infernal mosquito made me forget to set one of the dials." At his speech, I almost yelled with joy. A second ago, we had been stranded forever in an unthinkable country whose only inhabitants were wild animals and wilder savages. Austin had lain at my feet with his lifeblood slowly seeping from a vicious arrow wound in his chest. Now returning to the future was a pleasant certainty. While I couldn't help believing my friend would not succumb before I had him placed in the hands of a capable 20th century physician. "Tell me how to set that dial! Quick!" I breathed in exuberant spirits. "When we get home, I'll rush you off to a specialist, first thing."
No. First get this awful thing out of my chest. It may be poisoned."
I dissented, arguing that it might make his already critical condition even more serious. However, he was insistent, so, by the beam of a small but powerful electric torch I habitually carried, I set myself to the task of disengaging the slender shaft from Austin's body. I had terrible difficulty in drawing the thing out because it was barbed and stuck tenaciously. At last, through the insistence of the wounded man, I gave one quick wrench and literally tore it from his body. In horror and revulsion, I flung the thing from me. There was a sharp crackling, and it vanished in midair as it cleared the platform. Subconsciously, as I wiped my bloody hands on my trousers and jacket for want of a handkerchief, I remembered that the arrow had traveled into the future with us. Hence, it too had been under the control of the time machine until a moment before. While Austin lay resting quietly, I tried to set the correct dialing of the unfamiliar apparatus, as I had been directed to do. I had it at last and was about to throw the switch when Austin startled me by hoarsely yelling, "Wait!" I glanced inquiringly at him, but the darkness screened his face from me. A low moaning murmur reached me, and I knelt beside my poor friend, asking him what the matter was, though I thought I knew well enough.
"We're marooned."
My whole body felt chilled when he said that.
"We've spent some hours in the past. If we go back to 1930, it will be nearly 8 o'clock at night, and we left at 17 minutes to 6.
He sank back, exhausted. For a while I couldn't see the light. Then it flashed upon me in a burst of memory. That arrow. Something had happened to it when I cast it away. What was it Brahmas had said? "We are under the influence of the machine only while we stand on this platform. The moment we step off, heaven only knows what would happen." Bit by bit, I unraveled the knot. This is how I sized up the situation. We had spent 2 or 3 hours in the past. Now, unless we waited for a whole year, we would be unable to get off the machine should we reach our rightful time. The Eliminator would carry us a few hours into the future that we had never actually lived. Hence, to be able to resume our natural life, to be able to leave the machine without ill effects, we would have to stop the Time Eater at the exact moment we had originally left our world. I sobbed aloud in hopeless despondency.
"Here's one chance in a million. But we'll have to take it. I know the speed of my machine, and if I can figure out the time accurately enough, we may be able to get through all right. I pray that a minute or two off won't seriously injure us, but you must expect a violent jolt or perhaps unconsciousness."
A long pause, and then the halting speech continued with,
"Here's a pencil. Work this out for me."
The speaker extended toward me a stub of a pencil taken from his pocket. He lay back wearily, eyes closed. Placing my pocket flash on the control pedestal so that its rays illuminated a small space at my feet, I knelt, waiting for the dictation of my wounded friend. Then for 15 minutes I scribbled away, checking every step thrice. I couldn't afford to make a single mistake now, with our lives depending on the preciseness of the scrolling array of calculations on the luminous stone area. When I had finished, I placed my trembling fingers on the switch near the 2 rows of almost microscopic numerals, eyes fixed in thrilled expectancy on the second hand of my watch. Numbly, my hand twitched, and the time switch clicked over at the exact instant, leaving me taut and cold with apprehension. As the fateful second drew nigh, I forced a smile to my dry lips, bending close to the spot where I judged Austin's head to be. He was quietly awaiting the crucial moment. Grasping his limp hand in mine, I murmured, "If we don't make it, Goodbye, old fellow. He sighed in answer and muttered restlessly.
Forgive me, Arthur. Forgive. If you are killed, your life will be on my hands.
Nonsense. If anything disastrous happens to me now, it will be my fault entirely. Then, springing to my feet, I exclaimed, "It's time!" and flipped over the control switch. At the click of the switch, I plunged my left arm deep into the mechanism and with my right gave a terrific wrench at the gear lever, exerting every bit of strength I possessed. A flare of light, a gnashing of cogs, then blackness. Every ligament of my body was stretched, strained. I felt as though I was being torn apart on the rack. My left arm, entwined among the machinery, suddenly came free, running blood from the place where a steel fragment had bitten deeply. In a moment, the pain in my cut member merged into an endless, racking throb of torture that doubled me into a writhing, convulsed spasm of suffering. I seemed to be plunging through eternity, an eternity of pulsing torture. I drew a long, gasping breath into lungs that seemed dead. With almost difficulty, I managed to sit up. Soon a great amount of the nausea and pain left me. Except for the dull, throbbing ache in my left arm, I suffered from no undue strain. Then I thought of Austin. By the glare of the street lamp that poured in through the high, narrow window, I made out a vague, indistinct something lying near the old easy chair my friend had loved so well. I staggered to my feet, crossed the floor unsteadily. I was very weak and tired, and felt for the electric light button with my right hand, while the other hung limp and useless at my side. As the lights flashed on, I moaned aloud. Austin lay on his back, eyes distended, mouth agape, staring at the white ceiling, a horrible expression on his upturned face. Stooping beside him, I gave a quick glance around the room for the time eliminator. It was nowhere to be seen. More than likely, its ruined mechanism lay some hours behind us. At this, I was glad. I fervently hoped that no one would ever find and repair it. I prodded my friend gently, softly calling his name. He was dead. The fourth dimensional fall, if that's the correct term, had been too much for him in his weakened condition. Austin! Austin, get up! Get up quick! Quick! Can't you hear me? Don't you understand? Suddenly the little room seemed to sway, began whirling around and around at dizzying speed. Someone shouted in a muffled voice. A pounding at the door reached me faintly. I collapsed against the table, insensible. The events that followed are all fantastically unreal to me. They are jumbled like a half-forgotten nightmare. I awoke from a black emptiness to find myself being roughly dragged to my feet and shaken like a rag. A uniformed giant was yelling bewildering questions in harsh tones. "I don't know," was all I could mumble and answer. I don't know. In court, they said I had told them a wild tale about a machine that couldn't be found, and of terrible encounters with ferocious savages who shot my companion with arrows. Clearly the ravings of a demented being, they declared in formal accents. A policeman told of how he had rushed into Austin's laboratory in answer to a shriek and found me, hands and clothes stained with another's blood, hysterical and incoherent beside the body of my victim. Accusing voices demanded what I had done with the knife, and when I answered that I never owned one, derisive laughs echoed my reply. Lawyers pondered over the reason why I had committed the murder and answered themselves by saying that an insane man needs no motive. Of course, I protested the accusations, but what could I do when my own lawyers wouldn't listen to the truth? And so I was convicted and sent here, in this awful place, where the utterances of madmen fill the day, and fitful sleep is interrupted at night by screams of poor unfortunate creatures. All I've said has been actual truth. If you believe me, then by all that's holy, get me out! Get me out! Get me out! The Man Who Played with Time. Written by A.W. Burnell, told to you by Edward E. French. The copyright exists on all recordings issued by Edward E. French. Inquiries should be addressed to email edwardfrench06@hotmail.com. That's Edward French, 06 at hotmail.com. Thank you for listening. Good night.